Welcome to our CIE webinar, Israel in Context and on the Ground, the Palestinian-Israeli Clashes, May 2021. I'm Ken Stein, the founding president of the Center for Israel Education. In 2008, the Center for Israel Education was established with a mission to educate broadly to students, adults, and lifelong learners, focusing in what we write and what we share, namely the promotion of the concept that Israel is an integral and essential part of modern Jewish history, an essential part in the identity of Jews and Christians alike. Participating in this webinar, and we're delighted to have them both, is Dr. Sarah Feuer in Tel Aviv and Rabbi Mario Karpuj, who is in Jerusalem. Dr. Sarah Feuer is the Rosenbloom Family Fellow in the Washington Institute's Geduld program on Arab politics. She wrote Regulating Islam, Religion and State in Contemporary Morocco and Tunisia. It was published by Cambridge Press. She's an expert on the politics and religion across North Africa. She was previously a senior fellow at the Institute, where she authored numerous policy papers, monographs on the Maghreb and religion-state dynamics in the Arab world. She wrote in 2019, Course Correction, the Muslim World League, Saudi Arabia's Export of Islam, which examined the shifting contours of Saudi religious activity in the recent years. She lives in Tel Aviv. She's a research fellow presently at the Tel Aviv University Institute for National Security Studies. And most recently, a couple of days ago, she published in National Interest a piece on the broader impact of Hamas's actions in this clash with Israel, and we'll talk about them in a moment. Rabbi Mario Karpuj, someone I've known for almost 2 decades, was born in Argentina, where he received his ordination from the Seminario Rabínico Latinoamericano under very famous Marshall T. Meyer in '94. During his years at the rabbinical school in Buenos Aires, he served in 4 congregations in Argentina. In 1995, he became the first rabbi of the Congregación Israelita de Valparaíso in Chile. And in the year 2000, he moved with his family to Atlanta, where he served in the Ahavat Achim congregation. In 2003, he and his wife, Analia, became the founding rabbis of Congregation Or Hadash here in Sandy Springs, and I'm proud to say I was a founding member of that congregation. He has served widely in the city of Atlanta as a rabbinic leader, particularly interested in the interfaith issues that relate between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. He and his wife went on Aliyah to Israel last year, hence he's speaking to us today from Jerusalem. The topic of the webinar, the Palestinian clashes and the events that have coalesced to unfold them. The discussion will allow us to venture into discussions about the politics and issues which frame the clashes. 7 areas of focus are possible if we have the time. I'm going to ask each of our participants for their personal reactions to the clashes as they saw them unfold over 2 weeks, then move to what was Hamas's motivations. From there, talk a little bit about the media and how the media has handled these events, both in Israel and abroad. React a little bit to how Israeli society or groups within Israeli society have been engaged or been removed from the actual violence, focusing perhaps here on both the Israeli Arabs and the Haredim. What was the motivation of the Israeli Arabs, for example, to be swept along or of their own accord engage in clashes with Jews in mixed villages? 5th, what are the pathways out of this latest round of Israel confrontation? Does the latest round of violences or exchange put negotiations that much further down the road? Is there a pathway out, perhaps? And maybe speak a little bit about the most recent visit to the region by Secretary of State Blinken. Of course, it's all speculation on our part in terms of what may happen now, but we'll leave that for the end. A little bit of context, and that's why we are using the term context when we do these webinars. The Palestinian-Israeli clashes lasted from May 10th to May 21. They unfolded as quickly as they ended, or at least the ceasefire is held in place since a week ago. Friday. It was 11 days as compared to the 50 days of clashes that took place in 2014 between Israel and Hamas. This was the fourth sustained Israeli-Hamas clash since Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005. Previous long clashes have left Palestinians and Israeli dead, and the periodic attacks on Israel, intermittent between these four, have occurred with rocket fires into different parts of Israel. Hamas was established in 1988 as essentially an alternative to the PLO. It crafted a charter which essentially said that the area that Israel occupies is Muslim land, that Israel must be disestablished, no negotiations with Israel, no recognition of Israel. Essentially made the PLO and the PA that party in the Palestinian community that was likely to be a candidate for negotiations. And Hamas took the view that, no, we want absolutely no compromise with the Jewish state or with Zionism. In this 2021 conflict, it was reported that 250 Palestinians were killed and scores wounded, and a dozen Israelis also property damaged on both sides. Israeli defense forces apparently had effective responses and skilled plans in reacting to Hamas, and the Hamas leadership or the Hamas militants in Gaza fired maybe 3,000 or 4,000 rockets into Israeli civilian areas. In the broader context of this particular clash, what do we have going on? Well, a lot. I think a lot would be an understatement. We have Israeli politics. We have a prime minister yet to be appointed after March 23rd elections. We have a prime minister who is under indictment for corruption. The Palestinian Authority itself called off its elections in April, ostensibly because they felt that Palestinians in East Jerusalem could not vote, and therefore, if they could not vote, the elections wouldn't be fair. Most commentators would tell you that the Palestinian Authority postponed these elections primarily because they knew they would lose to a group of Hamas leaders. Hamas itself is seeking to compete with the PA for the hearts and minds in the direction of the Palestinian Arab National Movement. I'll leave that for a little bit further discussion as we move further along. And with that, Sarah, I would like to ask you if you would speak a little bit about the four concepts that you laid out in your national interest article, if they pertain to the webinar, as I think they do, and what does Hamas hope to gain out of this, and where should it be, or where would it like to be in 3 months from now, if you could go so far as to make a speculation. And we all know it's like trying to win the lottery. It's impossible to predict it accurately.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here. It's really a privilege. I've followed the work of the center for many years, and so this is a great opportunity to be with you all. A lot of the attention, certainly in Israel, and I think even in a lot of the media coverage of it, and we'll get to that later, I presume, but a lot of the attention was, of course, on the sort of day-to-day kind of tactical, how many rockets are we dealing with on our side? What's the IDF doing? What targets are they hitting in Gaza? And what I tried to do in the piece is zoom out a bit, because of course, as Ken, you alluded to, this happened in a broader regional context also. And there were, I think, at least 4 developments in recent years that help us understand why Hamas sort of struck out and did what it did in issuing this initially what was a sort of ultimatum to Israel, ostensibly in response to events unfolding in Jerusalem, and then just sort of took that as a way to launch what turned out to be a much broader attack on population centers. So I think there were 4 things that are worth keeping in mind. The first was that, in recent years, actually, you spoke about the founding of Hamas in the 80s. Hamas, of course, was linked to a broader transnational movement called the Muslim Brotherhood, which folks have probably heard of, what we sometimes refer to as political Islam, at least in the Sunni Muslim world. And that sort of camp, if we want to call it, in other words, movements around the region, and even I would say some states that had been promoting political Islam and the Brotherhood, had really been on the decline in recent years. And we can get into later sort of why that was. But essentially, since 2013, many of the Brotherhood's derivative movements around the region were not doing very well. Now, there was a related development, which was that another group of states, many of which had really sought to diminish the influence of the Brotherhood and of political Islam. These are states like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Morocco to some extent, Jordan, Egypt. So you already can hear that within this group are the states with which Israel signed these normalization agreements last year. This group, this bloc, had, I think, been a bit on the ascendant in recent years. They had had some success in pushing back against the Brotherhood. They also, of course, they're unified in their desire to try to diminish Iran's influence. So they had been sort of on the up and up, so to speak. The third development that I think fed into what we saw between Hamas and Israel earlier in the month was really a kind of declining regional significance of the Palestinian question. Now, we want to be careful here, because it's not that people or that populations in Arab states, or perhaps even Muslim states more generally, it's not that they stopped caring about Palestinians or that they lost their sympathy or solidarity for the Palestinian cause, but as an issue to try and galvanize people, get them out into the streets. Really, the Palestinian cause in the last decade had diminished in importance, mostly because people were too busy dealing with other problems closer to home. And the final thing that I think we saw, particularly in the last year or two, was that the group of actors around the region that were most closely linked to Iran, I think, were a bit on their back heels. I mean, Iran, of course, had enjoyed a sort of expanding influence over the last decade plus. And so you saw proxies in, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon. Bashar al-Assad in Syria has survived in part thanks to help from Iran. Iraq also, and Yemen, we've seen Iranian influence. But in the last year or two, Iran had also suffered some major setbacks. So these sort of four developments, I think, were, if not immediately discernible in this confrontation between Israel and Hamas, I think you can see the sort of imprint on it. So, for example, the fact that Hamas decided to do this in response to developments in Jerusalem, where Hamas doesn't have any real representation there formally anyway. It might have some support, but the Palestinian Authority is in charge there. So this was sort of, curious. This was why would Hamas have done this? And then kept up the rhetoric about Jerusalem. And I think a lot of this had to do with not only trying to deflate the Palestinian Authority, its kind of main political rival, but also to present itself more generally in the region as the protector of Palestinians, the protector of Islamic holy sites. That makes sense if you're trying to, inject some energy into what has otherwise been a kind of deflated strain or movement in recent years. And I think we also saw it in the fact that, Hezbollah, for example, yes, there were a couple of rockets that were launched from Lebanon. There was a drone that was reportedly an Iranian drone that was launched from Syria. But by and large, the Iranian-led camp was pretty quiet during this round. So those are examples of some of the hints of these broader regional dynamics. I'll just maybe close in this initial set of remarks by saying, since you asked kind of what does Hamas want and where are they potentially headed now? I think Hamas had a few goals here. I alluded to one of them earlier in sort of wanting to diminish the role of the PA, of the Palestinian Authority, and really establish themselves as the dominant actor, or really the head of the Palestinian national movement, okay? And I think in some ways they can claim some success in that, insofar as the PA is even more weakened than it was going into this. It was in very bad shape going into this whole set of developments, but it's even more difficult to see kind of how the PA will now sort of be resuscitated in terms of its own legitimacy. And the other thing I would note is on the ledger of sort of success and failure from Hamas's standpoint, when Hamas saw that, the internal strife started between Jews and Arabs within Israel, I think they saw that and really ran with it and tried to incite even more of it. And so from their standpoint, you asked about 3 months from now, I think if they see continued unrest within Israel, if they see regional actors failing to come to the aid of the PA, if they see the United States essentially take a sort of more passive approach, I think they will be fairly happy with how things turned out. I'll stop there and maybe we can return to some of these issues later in the discussion.
Right. Sarah, I noted in an article that was written by Dr. Yochanan Plessner, who is head of the Israel Democracy Institute, he made the case that Hamas's goal was to stir the pot amongst Israeli Arabs in order to have the whole question of 1948 be discussed rather than the issue of 1967, and turn the discussion of Palestinian-Israeli relations on toward what is Hamas's ultimate goal, the disestablishment of the state of Israel. I think Plessner got it right in his article, which he put on the Israel Democracy Institute website. And I think that would comport pretty well with what you have just said.
Yeah. Look, I don't know whether we're really able to say that from the get-go that was, and maybe it was, I don't know, I would have to check the chronology of this. There are other reasons that have nothing to do with Hamas for, the internal strife that we saw here. So I do think we need to be a little careful about over-ascribing, giving them too much credit. They would be very happy to claim this as an accomplishment on their part. And to some extent, certainly some of the more fringe elements that we saw in the Arab sector taking to the streets, yes, I mean, there is some sympathy for what Hamas has to offer. But I think Israel needs to be careful not to take the bait quite that far moving forward.
Mario, you have been a consumer of the media. You are a consumer of the media here in the United States as a rabbi and as an interested party in Israel's security and well-being and American foreign policy. You're in Israel now for a year. This was really, I think, the first major clash between Israelis and Palestinians since you arrived. Maybe this wasn't exactly a present, but if it was late in coming. In any case, what is your sense on how the media reports Israel, both inside Israel, maybe even before the clash, and outside? What kind of distinctions can you make, and what kind of conclusions have you come to?
Thank you first again for the invitation, and a pleasure to be here sharing these moments with you. Let me start by saying that it was a surprise in twofold. On May 10th is our youngest daughter, Adina's birthday. And we organized for her a surprise birthday party in a cafe in downtown Jerusalem. Really at 6 p.m., she didn't know. She was brought there not knowing where she was going. The moment she showed up there, we started singing her happy birthday. And the moment we finished, we hear a siren and we start wondering what's going on. And it took those 10 seconds until you say, like, believe it or not, we need to go inside because rockets are coming towards Jerusalem. I have spent the previous half an hour trying to get to downtown Jerusalem, navigating through the thousands upon thousands of families and youngsters who were with flags celebrating Jerusalem Day that day. And yes, you have seen the images of people going to the old city to challenge and to provoke. But the people who I saw in downtown Jerusalem, outside of the big synagogue in Keren Hayesod, they were just celebrating there. And the first thing that I thought when I got into the cafe to protect ourselves is these people out there have no protection whatsoever. In terms of the press, as you said, this was our first major clash between Israel and the Palestinians as Israelis. And I have to say that I spent most of my days during those 10 days watching the local press, glued to the TV and trying to see what was going on there. It was fascinating how things changed pretty quickly. First, it took me a couple of days to realize what was going outside of Israel and the attacks and the bad press and the pictures and the big articles that started with how many Palestinians are dead before trying to even start to explain what the situation was. Here, no matter which channel, which political party you heard, everybody was together. I mean, hundreds of rockets were falling on the south first, and then Jerusalem, and then in Tel Aviv and the center. And there was no opposition whatsoever. I mean, there's something about the bigger questions, some of the issues that Sarah was speaking about. At that moment, like, yes, we need to talk about those things, but let's put them on the side. Right now, hundreds of rockets are coming to our brothers and sisters everywhere, and we need to make sure that they are protected and that they're safe, and that we're sending the information where to stay and what to do, and that we're giving information in real time so people can take care of themselves. That was day 1 and 2. Then on day 2, that night, we have the big violence that happened in the city of Lod and the city of Ramle and in Akko, 3 cities that are kind of a picture of cities in which Jews and Arabs live together. And we started to hear stories about pogroms, literally, those the words that we were listening, in Akko and in Lod. And the following day, Jews coming back and attacking Arabs, and people trying to understand what was happening here. That was the biggest, I think, surprise. Nobody expected that, and it created a sense of disbelief, of tension, of worrisome that still remains until today. In a way, the feeling here was we're dealing with something that is much more dangerous than the Gaza situation. Kind of like after we got over the shock of those first 2 or 3 days, we went back to like taking care of, I mean, there were 2 days in which we didn't speak about Gaza. It was interesting. We were in the middle of a war with Hamas, and all we were talking about and all the images we were seeing was about violence within the country. It was like, almost like forgot. And then in the middle of that discussion, they will say, oh, by the way, the rock is falling on Tel Aviv. Go to the Mamal, to the secure areas in your homes or in your buildings. It's only after those first 2 or 3 days in which we went back, and I think to speak about 3 things. One, it was like the situation with Gaza and Hamas. A second one, that it was, we've seen this picture before. We start these confrontations and everybody says like, what do we have to do for this to be the last one? How do we don't just repeat this same cycle in which in 2 years, 3 years, 6 months or 5 years, we'll be back into this situation again? And the other big issue that still we're talking about today is about violence within the country. But if I have another 2 minutes, I would like to say that the violence within the country that is really, really the biggest issue I think we have today, you have to put it in context. After all, even though the images were awful, the amount of people who went out to get into clashes was very minimal, like, as part of the society. I live in Jerusalem, in a neighborhood in which I'm surrounded by Arab populations here. I see them every day, all day, in the streets, in the supermarket, in the shops that I go to, when I'm walking. And until today, we see a sense of tension when we see each other. But the tension is not, I don't want to live next to you. The tension is, I look at you and I'm trying to make sure that you're not coming to attack me right now. And after those 2 seconds in which we're okay, things kind of go back to normal. The biggest issue to me right now is how to empower this vast majority of Jews and Arabs in this country who live together, want to live together with all our problems, with all our inequalities, with all the things that we still have to solve, but who do not feel that Hamas represents them for the Arab population, and who don't have any other place or don't want to have any other place to go to live. And they're, all in all, happy living in this society.
Sarah, anything you want to comment, or should I just keep on moving?
I think you can keep going. I'll chime in later if there's...
One of the things we've noticed in the United States in terms of the mass media, and here I'm not even talking about social media, which is an entirely different world of blogs and Instagram and using words to connote X, Y, and Z concepts. There seems to be a conflation of terms of what's the difference between a civilian, a militant, a terrorist, a Hamas operative. How do you distinguish between the four? And all different newspapers would use different terms. And if you're for the first time coming across these terms, you're really not too familiar with the distinction. The second distinction that I noticed was in the term occupied. Some people were referring to the occupied territories as the territories that Israel conquered in the 1967 war. And we're really quite clear about it. And then there were others that just said Israel should leave the occupied territories, but the connotation means Israel should not be there because Israel exists on the land between the Jordan River and the sea. And so what happened this time, I think for the first time, was that people were beginning to ask the question about, you can't just use these terms anymore loosely. It might be a good idea if you put a definition to them. because they mean different things to different people with different ideologies and at different times. That I did not detect in any earlier confrontation between Israel and any of its neighbors, which I found to be quite interesting. What I also found quite interesting is that even though many newspapers and many media outlets made mention of Bibi Netanyahu's condition being at court for matters of corruption, and the fact that Israel had not formed a new government, very few people were willing to say, well, Benjamin Netanyahu did this intentionally in order to detract attention away from his own personal condition or his own inability to form a government. I think the skeptics and the cynics may have just put that thought to bed. Then that became the whole issue of, immediately it transferred to what's a war crime? How do you define someone who's doing something against civilians? And if someone is shooting rockets from civilian locations, is that a war crime? And if someone is indiscriminate in attacking civilians, is that a war crime? I noticed that in the Washington Post, and this was something I was not expecting. In the Washington Post, Charles Lane wrote, from the moment Hamas fired the conflict's first shot on May 10th, ostensibly in response to Israeli police aggression at the Aqsa Mosque, until the fighting stopped roughly 11 days later, the Gaza-based Islamic organization launched more than 4,000 rockets. He said, quote, that's 4,000 war crimes, or an average of 363 per day. I had never seen something like that in the English media. Maybe I'm just not reading the right newspapers in a really long time. And then the politicians jumped in. Then you had all sorts of people who were taking phrases and Israel is this and Israel is that. And then you had the political influencers. We had evening hosts on TV programs who all of a sudden were becoming experts on the Middle East, as if influencers all of a sudden know the deep roots of the Arab-Israeli conflict. But you know, everyone's got a blog post. Everyone gets their 2 cents in. Let me go back to Israeli society for a moment. In the weeks prior to this, there was a massive death of 45 Israelis and a Lag BaOmer celebration. 45 people were trampled to death. That took place maybe in 4 or 5 hours. Now, this is no moral equivalence whatsoever. But there were 12 Israelis who were killed in the Hamas clashes, and 45 who were killed by Israelis in a stampede. The loss of life is horrendous, no matter what side it's on. And it occurs to me that we always seem to make an evaluation based on numbers. And sometimes our numbers are not complete. Sometimes we get a number that is used by one media outlet, and then it's copied for 5 or 6 days. Well, where did I get it from? Sarah, shifting gears, pathways out, diplomacy, foreign affairs, the US president, his Secretary of State comes to the region just as the ceasefire ends. Obviously, I think he timed it so he could put his Elmer's glue on the ceasefire and keep it from cracking or falling apart. It may still fall apart. What can the United States or the EU or the UN do for a pathway to come out of this that doesn't guarantee another outbreak in 3 to 5 years? And again, it's silly of me to say that doesn't guarantee, because there's no such thing. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no shortage of ideas about what to do. I mean, I think that there is a kind of consensus that has come now, especially in comparison to the experience coming out of the last big round in 2014. You know, in 2014, we also saw international community try to come together and think about, first of all, how to rebuild Gaza. That's a whole question. And there was, in 2014, also concern to not allow Hamas to, you know, rebuild itself along the way. So the questions, unfortunately, are very familiar to us. I think there are maybe a few things that the United States and I think also Israel should be really pushing for. Whether it's going to happen is another question, and I can't read the future. But, you know, who gets to decide now what goes into Gaza toward the sort of rehabilitation and the rebuilding of the Strip? It is more in Israel's interest, and I would say also in the US interest, to see the Egyptians taking a bigger role in that. You don't want to see the Qataris, who have generally been, funding Hamas, with some Israeli acquiescence to that, and that's a whole other can of worms. But so who gets to be around the table to decide, what is going to happen in Gaza now? I think if Israel can enlist the involvement of some of its newer friends, so in the UAE, Bahrain, even tacitly, if the Saudis want to try to lend more assistance in Gaza, the Moroccans, get Israel's sort of quote unquote friends involved. And at the same time, try to give the PA, give the Palestinian Authority, you got to give them something to be able to show that a nonviolent approach to dealing with Israel pays dividends. Because right now, the PA doesn't really have much to show for that. And so I think if we don't see regional actors and the United States really try to make a serious push to lift up the PA and to make sure that, the truth is that, the mechanisms for rebuilding Gaza after 2014 that were under the auspices of the UN and the EU, those actually worked quite well. And none of that stuff really made its way into Hamas's hands. The problem, I think, we're understanding better now, is that there was at least one crossing between Egypt and Gaza that turned out to be quite problematic, because for whatever reason, Israel didn't have much eyes on what was going in and out. So, internationally run mechanisms for economic resuscitation of the Strip, those actually work quite well. And we should be pushing to really make them much, much more robust. Now, of course, Hamas is going to have a vote in all of this. And that's why it's unclear, really, whether Israel and its allies are going to manage to come up with a mechanism that efficiently, weakens Hamas at this point. But at the very least, we should be making sure that their outside sources of funding and support are strangled, and trying to build up what is left of the forces within the Palestinian territories that have offered, as flawed as it is, that they've offered an alternative to what Hamas is offering.
Mario, thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with what Sarah was saying. I think a couple of things. The PA actually played a role, an active role, in not allowing the violence that we saw within the country go big in the West Bank. They actually stopped that against the wishes of Hamas. That was, in a way, a silent but really big victory in terms of the future. I think that there is a reality that the people we are back to normal. Any of you coming to visit today, I can pick you up at the airport. I will bring you to Jerusalem. I can take you to visit Sarah in Tel Aviv. You will never know that we had a war last week here, because we have invested millions upon millions of dollars to protect ourselves from the rockets that are falling. And I was yesterday in the center of the country. You could never tell that there was a war here. In the West Bank, in Ramallah, in other cities, life is go back to normal. It's only in Gaza in which they will be now for years trying to rebuild what was destroyed in the last 10 days. It should be some kind of cost. I think that at some point people look at that and say, I don't want to live in that thing. Even if Hamas succeeded in make us proud because they are standing for all of us in this, this idea of a Palestinian state from the sea to the river. The reality is that we don't want to live in that place. We don't want to live in that reality. We don't want to live without water and with 4 hours of electricity a day. So if the rebuilding is done in a way in which Hamas cannot take credit for that, it will be great. We hear this both in Israel and in Blinken's visit about trying to funnel the funds through the PA. How that actually works when you have to put the money in Gaza, it's a little different thing. A little other thing that you brought before about Meron. and how quick things happen here. Remember that only tomorrow will be a month since that tragedy. I mean, we were still in the shocking. We haven't got to the month. And I think that speaks to the bigger issue that we have in this country. Some years ago, Rivlin, in his major speech of his presidency, I would say, he spoke about the 4 tribes that live in this country. The secular and the national religious, the ultra-Orthodox and the Arabs, and how to try to bring them together. I see in this country 2 bigger tribes. One tribe is the tribe that we call the Israeli tribe. And the other one is the tribe of, I live in this place, but I don't want to belong to the Zionist project. And I want to be very clear. There are many, many, many ultra-Orthodox, and there are many, 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 many Arabs who belong to tribe 1, to the Israeli one, and they live here and they want to be part of this project. There's also some forces who don't want to be here, and we need to do a better job to bring them into the fold and to make sure that they, in some way or form, feel like part of this without having to wait until violence erupts. That's the problem, that we take care of, we talk about these things and we try to do things when we have in the midst of a crisis. How do we do that without having to wait until violence erupts to do that?
There have been, in the last 6 months, a series of webinars and editorials written in the Arab and the Palestinian Arab media, which have raised significant doubts about the ability of either Hamas or the PA to be institutions that could be drivers to bring the Palestinians forward to whatever that next position is. On May 10th, Professor Rashid Khalidi, in a YouTube presentation, made the following remark. If a free election in which Palestinians were told Fatah, Hamas, or none of the above would probably win, because most Palestinians recognize the utter bankruptcy of both sides in terms of unifying Palestinian rights, or in terms of putting forward an internationally recognizable strategy so that the people can support us. There is some grave doubt amongst Palestinian thinkers about whether the PA should actually be resurrected or just torn down and rebuilt. And one just has to look at Khalid Shikaki's surveys that he does at the Jerusalem Center for Policy Survey and Research, in which he indicates just how shallow Palestinian Arab support is for either Hamas or for the PLO. We know from what happened in 1993 that Yasser Arafat chose to recognize the state of Israel because he wanted to save himself as the leader of the PLO. We know that. We know that from many Palestinian authors and from many people who were there at the time. And one needs to be careful of instituting a process where all you're going to do is create and I'm saying this not with bad feeling, but create a Palestinian leadership that is crippled by its own dysfunctional capacity. And so, yes, you want to keep, as Sarah said, funds out of the hands of Hamas, but at the same token, are you going to put it into a place where the organization itself will not be able to deliver? And if that is the case, my suggestion, and it's one that I've put forth on several occasions in the past, is the international community should try and create a trusteeship for the West Bank / Gaza, where the accountability could be monitored and progress could be made to making the condition of the Palestinians better. But that would take an enormous effort on the part of all parties to the conflict. Michelle, if you would, could you give us some questions, please?
The first question comes from Stephen. Zivi Livni has an editorial in today's New York Times advocating for a two-state solution. Is this idea still viable? And if so, what are the pressures for and against its realization?
I'm skeptical about a two-state solution right now. There's just too much absence of trust. Sarah, Mario?
I believe that we don't have any other option. I agree with you with the lack of trust. I agree with you with actors in Israel and outside of Israel working against it. By the way, Bibi's role in all this thing within Israel did not go unnoticed, and it was pretty openly on the news and TV's panels talking about his responsibility and claiming he was, together with Hamas, the two big winners of these last clashes. So, but we don't have any other option. I don't know in which way it will happen. I have no idea how to make the borders there. But if we still dream about a Jewish democratic state, there's no other way. There's no other way.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add to that. I agree. Look, there was, I think, an effort on the part of Israel to keep the West Bank and Gaza really as separated sort of politically as possible in the last decade plus, because this was seen as essentially partly an attempt to keep them weak. I mean, let's face it. I think that there's going to be a real revisiting now of that approach, because I think for a lot of people, what they saw in this last round was really a kind of one byproduct of that policy, is that you keep them separated. Well, it only ends up emboldening, one side only ended up emboldened, and it certainly didn't work in Israel's interests. So
our next question comes from Ian, and he's asked, after Secretary of State Blinken's warning, do you think that Israel will carry out the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah of Arabs from homes previously owned by Jews, or do you think that Israel might grant Arab Jerusalemites the right to eject Jews from homes previously owned by Arabs?
I wouldn't mess around with trying to answer that question, because you got the Israeli Supreme Court. I would have no idea what the right answer would be.
The second part of the question, if I understood it right, I don't think you're likely to see Israel amend. This has to do with a law, I think, that allows for Jewish Israelis to reclaim land that they owned, even if it was prior to 48. And there is no equivalent law in the other direction. In other words, we're not granting Arabs who might have owned land in the territory that was before Israel was declared as a state. That's true. It's understandable why that's problematic. But so I don't anticipate Israel amending the law to make it possible, at least under the current sort of political climate. I don't see that happening. I would hope that, I don't know, like Ken, I don't know what the Supreme Court is going to decide. I don't know where this case is going to go, but I think that they rightly postponed at least discussion once they saw that it was very, very combustible. And I hope that there will be discussions about weighing the merits. Look, legally, this really should have been just a kind of dispute over property. But of course, it's not just, this is Jerusalem. And so you have to weigh the kind of legal merits of these things against the political realities on the ground. And if it can save, a modicum of sort of social calm, to me, that's a pretty overwhelming consideration. I don't know whether the court is going to agree with that, but that's what I would hope anyway.
I just want to say thank you, Sarah, for being so clear, I think, about this. It's not Israel trying to evict people. There's a legal case that the Supreme Court needs to weigh on. It's a very problematic issue for exactly what Sarah says, that the law only gives permission to Jews to reclaim lands that they owned before 48 and not the other way around. In any case, it's totally ridiculous to think that dispute gave any kind of legitimacy to Hamas to start throwing rockets all over Israel. And this is important also to know. Yes, we have a problem, and it's a very problematic issue there in Sheikh Jarrah. From there to say that anybody had the right to start throwing rockets is like to say that the Mexican government is not happy with the way migrants are treated in the border and start throwing rockets to San Diego.
And I just want to emphasize what Mario just said, because it actually goes back to the discussion you were having earlier about the media. One of the difficulties I had to the extent that I was following during the war, I call it a war. I know around here people prefer lowering the temperature a little bit. To me, it felt like a war. I mean, when there are rockets coming over my head like that, I tried to limit a little bit my intake of international coverage because I suspected that it was maybe going to raise my blood pressure even more. But one of the things that was difficult for me was this precisely that dynamic that Mario just said, I found that very often there were incidents that were reported on, such as the Sheikh Jarrah dispute, which is a serious one. And there is underlying it, there is an issue here, and Israel needs to confront that. And we need to be able to talk about that. But to lump that in with as the sort of precursor to Hamas, people would maybe be interested to know that 3 weeks before any of this, the IDF had approached the cabinet with intelligence that Hamas had been preparing something major, that they were getting ready to act. And actually, the IDF's plan for preempting this and trying to prevent it was turned down by the cabinet. So the notion that Sheikh Jarrah sort of, sparked everything, this is what was later, I found a sort of dominant narrative in some of the media, I think was really problematic. And it doesn't diminish from the problematic nature of what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah. We need to deal with that. But as soon as you lump it in with rockets, I think you see what I'm getting at.
I'm going to reach back into a dissertation called The Land Question in Palestine, which I wrote a long time ago, in which the issue under the British was, how do you protect cultivators, tenants, when landowners sell land over the heads of the tenants? And the answer was, you give them either financial compensation or you provide them other lands. It would seem to me that land swap, or something that's creative, where no one's going to feel terribly happy, but no one's going to feel like they gave up forever their place where they were living, would seem to be a way to go about it, to thread a really tough needle. And this may have, in fact, been offered in 2010 as an option, when Sheikh Jarrah blew up the first time, or the first time in a long number of years. That's just a thought from yesterday.
This question comes from Evan. He would like to know what it would take and how long it would take to build trust between Israeli Jews and Arabs living in the land of Israel.
You're talking about Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews? You're talking about Israelis living in pre-67 with Arabs who live not in pre-67?
I think we could answer both.
Well, I think Mario pointed out just how stunned people were by what happened in the mixed cities. There's no doubt about it. Arabs who live in Israel, whether you call them Palestinian Arabs or Israeli Arabs, want and expect a certain kind of standard of living, a certain kind of policing in their villages, a certain kind of level of provision equal to that might be found in predominantly Jewish villages or Jewish settlements. And that level should be achieved. That level should be attained. It's not where it should be, but there have been efforts made in that direction. It doesn't do much to say that when you have 20 to 25% of Israeli Arab youth between the ages of 18 and 30 who are underemployed or unemployed. And they just are frustrated. And that's a reality. But there are a high number of people who are underemployed and unemployed in other parts of the Middle East, other parts of the world, for that matter. In Israel, with Israeli Arabs, the reality is they see right around the corner, right next door, 2 kilometers down the road, a very different reality. And they want to be part of that reality, even if they can be beneficiaries of a healthcare system and have access to education. It still is not satisfactory to them. I don't know how else to explain it. As far as Israelis and Arabs in the territories, that one I have a lot less of a handle on in terms of being able to even give a remote answer.
If I can just give my 2 cents, the issue is always from down up. When we live together and we share the space and we build together, trust happens. Again, as I said before, I interact with Arabs every single day who come to my home to repair something. I go to their shops to buy things. We are in the same supermarkets. There is something there. The problem with the Palestinians on the West Bank, the only Jews mostly they see are settlers inside their barbed wire places or soldiers. So you never actually interact much in order to create that kind of trust, and that will take a much longer time. because you mentioned about the inequalities, economic inequalities, Ken, the Israel government 5 years ago passed a plan to inject 4 billion shekels, that is a little over $1 billion, to our communities, to better infrastructure and education and health. The result of that, unintended of course, is that that money went to cities in which only Arabs live. So the cities in the north, their school system is better, their education, their health is better. In the cities in which Jews and Arabs live together, that money didn't show up there. Mm-hmm. And those Arabs are falling behind their brothers and sisters who live in cities by themselves. And that was also part of the entire anger happening here.
It's a great distinction, Mario. Thank you. That's a really great distinction. I think, guys, we've come to an end. The webinar was aimed at providing context to the events and those that are unfolding in Israel and around Israel. We on our website, israeled.org, try and promote content for context purposes. We want to provide anyone interested in learning or learning nuance to look at our recommendations for contemporary readings, podcasts, webinars, and other digital materials. Sarah, Mario, to all those on the call, thank you for joining us.